The air in the king's grand palace was not just air, it was a living, breathing entity, heavy with the weight of centuries of unspoken words and buried desires. For Alara, who was a girl of 16 and had arrived from a village where the air tasted of fresh earth and clean rain, the palace atmosphere was a suffocating blanket. It smelled of old, polished wood, the faint, sweet scent of forgotten flowers from a long-dead queen's gardens, and a sharp, metallic tang of cold, damp stone. Her first few weeks were an unending blur of exhausting labor. Her hands were perpetually raw from scrubbing the immense iron pots until they gleamed like silver. She was a ghost in the vast kitchens, a faceless part of a massive, unfeeling machine. She learned the rules of her new life swiftly. Do not look at a royal, for their gaze could burn. Do not speak, for your voice could carry a curse. And most importantly, never, ever set foot in the north wing after the sun had fallen. This last rule was the most heavily enforced, spoken of in hushed, trembling tones by the older servants. The north wing, they whispered, belonged to the late Queen Ethelred, whose heart had been shattered by an unknown tragedy. Her life had ended there, they said, and her spirit still haunted its long, empty halls, searching for the single, precious thing she had lost before her final breath. The whispers were filled with genuine fear, and Alara, a practical girl from a simple village, found herself swayed by the strange, mournful melody that sometimes drifted through the palace, a tune so sad it could make your bones ache. She didn't believe in ghosts, but the palace had a way of convincing you. The massive stone walls seemed to watch you, the dark corners held shadows that were too deep to be natural, and the intricate tapestries on the walls seemed to shift, their woven threads of knights and dragons coming to life in the flickering candlelight. One evening, after the last royal feast had ended and the kitchens were finally silent, Alara was given a new task. The head steward, a gaunt man with eyes like chipped ice, needed a message delivered to the West Tower. The shortest path, he said, his voice a low growl, is through the north wing. Do not delay, girl. I need this delivered before the first watch changes. A knot of cold dread formed in Alara's stomach, but she swallowed it down. Duty was duty. And the head steward's impatience was a known force of nature, far more dangerous than any ghost story. She took a deep, shaky breath and pushed open the heavy oak door leading to the forbidden wing. A blast of unnaturally cold air hit her, so cold it felt solid, a stark and shocking contrast to the warm, busy hall she had just left. The torches in the corridor burned with a dim, sickly yellow light, their flames dancing wildly, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to stretch and curl like living things. Every one of her footsteps, usually silent, now echoed with a sharp, hollow sound that seemed to chase her. As she hurried along, her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt a sudden, sharp drop in the temperature, a chill that went straight to her bones, and a low, sorrowful melody, the very one she had heard before, now seemed to be coming from just ahead. The sound was not of a lute or a flute, but of a woman's voice, weeping. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat, and peered around the corner. The hallway stretched on, a seemingly endless stone tunnel, until it reached a single door. This door, unlike all the others, stood ajar. It was the door to the Queen's private study, a room that had been sealed for 10 years, locked away with the secrets of a dead woman. Yet there it was, open. A faint, golden light spilled from within, defying the shadows. A powerful, morbid curiosity she couldn't suppress pulled her forward. She crept closer, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. With a shaking hand, she pushed the door wider and peered inside. The room was not dusty as she expected. It was pristine, as if someone had just left. The rich velvet curtains were drawn, and a single, thick candle flickered on a small writing desk. On the desk, in the glow of the lone candle, sat a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, its wood dark and smooth, etched with what looked like ancient, forgotten symbols. The lid was slightly ajar, a tiny, dark gap inviting her to look closer. A voice in her mind screamed at her to run, to leave this place. But another voice, a strange, quiet one she had never heard, urged her to know its secret. As Alara reached out a trembling hand to touch the box, to feel the cool, smooth wood, the door behind her slammed shut with a thunderous bang. The sound was so loud it made her jump back, and in the sudden vacuum of noise, the candle on the desk was extinguished, plunging the room into a total, suffocating darkness. Her heart was in her mouth, a frantic, trapped bird. A low, mournful whisper slithered through the silence, no longer a distant melody, but a clear, chilling voice right behind her, speaking a single, terrifying word: Aurelian. The name hung in the air, a final, fragile note of sorrow, before being swallowed by the silence. Alara's mind reeled. The name was a man's name, but it was not the king's. It was the name of the queen's long-lost brother, Prince Aurelian, who, according to the official histories, had died bravely in a far-off battle years ago. But why would the queen's ghost whisper his name? The very question sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The air grew even colder, and she felt a touch, light as a feather but cold as ice, on her hand. It was the hand she had reached out to touch the wooden box with. She shrieked, a small, choked sound of terror, and stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle any more noise. In her panic, her foot caught on something on the floor, and she fell, her elbow hitting the corner of the writing desk with a sharp thud. The sound seemed to awaken something in the room. The air shifted, and the mournful presence seemed to recede, as if startled by the noise. Alara didn't wait. She scrambled to her feet, her hands fumbling blindly in the dark for the door handle. Her fingers found it, cold and smooth, and she yanked on it with all her strength. It was locked. A fresh wave of despair washed over her. She was trapped. Trapped in a room with a ghost who whispered the names of the dead. She pulled again, her knuckles white, and again, but the door wouldn't budge. As she pulled, her hand brushed against the pocket of her simple, coarse tunic. Her fingers closed around a small, heavy object. She had no memory of picking it up. It must have been the thing she had tripped over. She couldn't spare a thought for it now. Her only goal was to escape. She began to feel along the cold stone wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The head steward would be angry, but he would be better than whatever was in this room with her. She found the latch on the inside, a heavy iron bar. She pushed, and finally, with a loud, grating protest, the bar slid back. The lock was not in the door, it was on the outside. Someone had barred it. Alara pushed the door open, a sliver of light from the corridor outside spilling in. She didn't look back. She ran, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, not stopping until she was out of the north wing and back in the familiar, though still unnerving, territory of the main palace. She leaned against the wall, her body trembling, and took in deep, shuddering breaths. The air was warmer here. It smelled of food and fire, and the distant murmur of the night guards offered a comforting, if faint, sense of security. No one seemed to have heard the bang of the door or her terrified cry. The head steward was nowhere to be seen. Alara slipped back to the kitchens, moving like a shadow. She was safe, but the terror was still a cold knot in her stomach. Later that night, curled on her straw mattress in the servants' quarters, a place where the other girls giggled and whispered about the palace guards, Alara couldn't sleep. The single, terrifying word echoed in her mind. Aurelian. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the object she had accidentally taken. She pulled it out. It was a tarnished silver locket, shaped like a heart. It was old and beautiful, with intricate carvings of vines and leaves on its surface. She worked at the clasp with her fingernail, and it finally snapped open with a soft click. Inside, tucked against the tarnished silver, were two small, perfectly painted portraits. One was of the late Queen Ethelred, her face full of a sad, quiet beauty. The other was a man. His face was strong and kind, with a hint of sorrow in his eyes. He had the same dark hair and elegant nose as the queen. He was wearing the uniform of a prince. On the back of the locket, there was an engraving, a stylized sun with 8 rays, and a single letter, A. Alara's mind, always practical, began to connect the dots. The ghost had spoken Prince Aurelian's name. The locket was a secret treasure, hidden in the queen's private study. The man in the portrait was the prince, and the official story was that he had died. But what if he hadn't? What if he had just vanished? She remembered a faded portrait she had seen in a dusty corridor once, a portrait of the royal family. She had paid it no mind, but now, a flash, A new mystery, far more dangerous than any ghost story, began to unfold in Alara's mind. The Queen's death, the locked room, the mournful weeping, the locket, it all pointed to a secret that had been buried with the Queen for 10 years. She suddenly understood the true meaning of the silence in the palace. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet of a tomb, holding a secret too dangerous to be spoken. The older maids feared the ghost, but Alara feared something else entirely. She feared the living, and what they had done. She knew she had to go back to the North Wing, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a desperate need to find out the truth. The next night, her heart still a frantic drum against her ribs, Alara made her way to the North Wing. This time, she was prepared. She had managed to sneak a small oil lantern from the kitchens and a simple, sharp knife from a basket of discarded tools. She moved through the palace like a true ghost, using the shadows, her footsteps silent. She reached the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The cold air rushed out to meet her, the familiar chill that seemed to promise bad things. The corridor was as she had left it. The torches were dim, the shadows long and twisted. As she approached the Queen's study, she felt the presence again. The weeping, soft and sorrowful, was there, a low hum of sound in the air. The door was closed this time, and a thick, rusty padlock hung from the iron bar. It was an old lock, but it was secure. Alara's heart sank. She had been so certain she could get back in. But then she noticed the thin gap in the stone where the door met the frame. With a trembling hand, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a hairpin she had taken. With a focused, determined mind, she worked the lock. It was a simple lock, and after a few moments of jiggling and pushing, it clicked. She pushed the iron bar aside and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight that cut through the velvet curtains. The writing desk stood in the center, a dark shape against the light. The wooden box was there, its lid still ajar. But as she moved to the desk, she felt the presence. It was stronger now, a palpable weight in the air. The weeping was louder, a sound of profound despair. She ignored it, her focus entirely on the box. She had to know. She opened the box fully, and inside, she found not a treasure, but a single, rolled-up piece of parchment. With trembling hands, she took it out and unrolled it. The writing was fine and elegant, written in the Queen's own hand. It was a letter, addressed to her brother. "My dearest Aurelian," it began. "I write this with a heavy heart, for I fear our time is running out. I have discovered the truth, the horrible secret that our king hides, and I know that he suspects I know. He is not the man we believed him to be, and he has allied himself with forces that seek to harm the kingdom. He has locked me in my own study, and I fear he means to have me fall ill and perish. Do not come for me. You must flee. I have hidden the evidence in a place only you would know. It will prove his treason. Do not trust the head steward. He is a traitor. And above all, know that I love you. Do not avenge me. Avenge our kingdom. Run, and keep this secret safe. I pray you are well. Your sister Ethelred." Alara's breath hitched. She had stumbled upon a conspiracy that went to the highest levels of the kingdom. The king was a traitor. The head steward was complicit. And the prince had not died, but had fled. The ghost was not an evil spirit, but a heartbroken one, trying to protect a secret. The mournful voice was the Queen's, weeping for the brother she had sent away to save him. As she finished reading, a new sound cut through the silence. It was not the weeping of a ghost, but the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man, coming down the corridor. Her heart pounded in her ears. It was not a ghost. It was someone real. The footsteps stopped right outside the study. The doorknob jiggled, slowly, then more forcefully. Someone was trying to get in. Alara's mind screamed at her to move. She blew out her lantern, plunging the room into darkness, and scrambled to hide, ducking behind a heavy, velvet curtain just as the door was slowly pushed open. Alara's breath caught in her throat, a tiny, frozen gasp as the heavy door to the Queen's study was slowly pushed inward. She was pressed flat against the cold stone wall, hidden by the thick, dusty folds of the velvet curtain, the Queen's treasonous letter clutched so tightly in her hand that the parchment felt like a second skin. The man who entered was not the head steward she had expected, nor was he the king. He was a large, powerfully built guard, his chain mail glinting dimly in the moonlight that cut through the drawn curtains. His face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes darting around the room with a practiced, predatory quickness. He was not here by chance. He was here on a mission. He held a small, glowing orb in his hand, a light source Alara had never seen before, and as he held it out, its soft, ethereal glow pushed back the shadows and illuminated the room, bathing it in a pale, almost ghostly light. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate thing trying to escape her chest. The suffocating darkness was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed in on her, and the cold, mournful whisper was a living thing right at her ear. It was no longer a distant echo, but a chilling, clear voice, speaking a single, terrifying word. Aurelian! The name hung in the air, a final, fragile note of sorrow, before being swallowed by the silence. Alara's mind reeled. The name was a man's name, but it was not the king's. It was the name of the queen's long-lost brother, Prince Aurelian, who, according to the official histories, had died bravely in a far-off battle years ago. But why would the queen's ghost whisper his name? The very question sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The air grew even colder, and she felt a touch, light as a feather but cold as ice, on her hand. It was the hand she had reached out to touch the wooden box with. She shrieked, a small, choked sound of terror, and stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle any more noise. In her panic, her foot caught on something on the floor, and she fell, her elbow hitting the corner of the writing desk with a sharp thud. The sound seemed to awaken something in the room. The air shifted, and the mournful presence seemed to recede, as if startled by the noise. Alara didn't wait. She scrambled to her feet, her hands fumbling blindly in the dark for the door handle. Her fingers found it, cold and smooth, and she yanked on it with all her strength. It was locked. A fresh wave of despair washed over her. She was trapped. Trapped in a room with a ghost who whispered the names of the dead. She pulled again, her knuckles white, and again, but the door wouldn't budge. As she pulled, her hand brushed against the pocket of her simple, coarse tunic. Her fingers closed around a small, heavy object. She had no memory of picking it up. It must have been the thing she had tripped over. She couldn't spare a thought for it now. Her only goal was to escape. She began to feel along the cold stone wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The head steward would be angry, but he would be better than whatever was in this room with her. She found the latch on the inside, a heavy iron bar. She pushed, and finally, with a loud, grating protest, the bar slid back. The lock was not in the door. It was on the outside. Someone had barred it. Alara pushed the door open, a sliver of light from the corridor outside spilling in. She didn't look back. She ran, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, not stopping until she was out of the north wing and back in the familiar, though still unnerving, territory of the main palace. She leaned against the wall, her body trembling, and took in deep, shuddering breaths. The air was warmer here. It smelled of food and fire, and the distant murmur of the night guards offered a comforting, if faint, sense of security. No one seemed to have heard the bang of the door or her terrified cry. The head steward was nowhere to be seen. Alara slipped back to the kitchens, moving like a shadow. She was safe, but the terror was still a cold knot in her stomach. Later that night, curled on her straw mattress in the servants' quarters, a place where the other girls giggled and whispered about the palace guards, Alara couldn't sleep. The single, terrifying word echoed in her mind. Aurelian! She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the object she had accidentally taken. She pulled it out. It was a tarnished silver locket, shaped like a heart. It was old and beautiful, with intricate carvings of vines and leaves on its surface. She worked at the clasp with her fingernail, and it finally snapped open with a soft click. Inside, tucked against the tarnished silver, were two small, perfectly painted portraits. One was of the late Queen Ethelred, her face full of a sad, quiet beauty. The other was a man. His face was strong and kind, with a hint of sorrow in his eyes. He had the same dark hair and elegant nose as the queen. He was wearing the uniform of a prince. On the back of the locket, There was an engraving. Alara's mind, always practical, began to connect the dots. The ghost had spoken Prince Aurelian's name. The locket was a secret treasure, hidden in the Queen's private study. The man in the portrait was the prince, and the official story was that he had died. But what if he hadn't? What if he had just vanished? She remembered a faded portrait she had seen in a dusty corridor once, a portrait of the royal family. She had paid it no mind, but now, a flash of memory returned to her. The king, the queen, and a young man with a familiar face, Prince Aurelian. The painting showed a strange tension between the king and the prince. The king looked jealous, almost angry. The prince, however, was looking at his sister, the queen, with a look of deep affection and concern. A new mystery, far more dangerous than any ghost story, began to unfold in Alara's mind. The queen's death, the locked room, the mournful weeping, the locket, it all pointed to a secret that had been buried with the queen for 10 years. She suddenly understood the true meaning of the silence in the palace. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet of a tomb, holding a secret too dangerous to be spoken. The older maids feared the ghost, but Alara feared something else entirely. She feared the living, and what they had done. She knew she had to go back to the North Wing, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a desperate need to find out the truth. The next night, her heart still a frantic drum against her ribs, Alara made her way to the North Wing. This time, she was prepared. She had managed to sneak a small oil lantern from the kitchens and a simple, sharp knife from a basket of discarded tools. She moved through the palace like a true ghost, using the shadows, her footsteps silent. She reached the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The cold air rushed out to meet her, the familiar chill that seemed to promise bad things. The corridor was as she had left it. The torches were dim, the shadows long and twisted. As she approached the queen's study, she felt the presence again. The weeping, soft and sorrowful, was there, a low hum of sound in the air. The door was closed this time, and a thick, rusty padlock hung from the iron bar. It was an old lock, but it was secure. Alara's heart sank. She had been so certain she could get back in. But then she noticed the thin gap in the stone where the door met the frame. With a trembling hand, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a hairpin she had taken. With a focused, determined mind, she worked the lock. It was a simple lock, and after a few moments of jiggling and pushing, it clicked. She pushed the iron bar aside and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight that cut through the velvet curtains. The writing desk stood in the center, a dark shape against the light. The wooden box was there, its lid still ajar. But as she moved to the desk, she felt the presence. It was stronger now, a palpable weight in the air. The weeping was louder, a sound of profound despair. She ignored it, her focus entirely on the box. She had to know. She opened the box fully, and inside, she found not a treasure, but a single, rolled-up piece of parchment. With trembling hands, she took it out and unrolled it. The writing was fine and elegant, written in the Queen's own hand. It was a letter, addressed to her brother. "My dearest Aurelian," it began. "I write this with a heavy heart, for I fear our time is running out. I have discovered the truth, the horrible secret that our king hides, and I know that he suspects I know. He is not the man we believed him to be, and he has allied himself with forces that seek to harm the kingdom. He has locked me in my own study, and I fear he means to have me fall ill and perish. Do not come for me. You must flee. I have hidden the evidence in a place only you would know. It will prove his treason. Do not trust the head steward. He is a traitor. And above all, know that I love you. Do not avenge me. Avenge our kingdom. Run, and keep this secret safe. I pray you are well. Your sister Ethelred." Alara's breath hitched. She had stumbled upon a conspiracy that went to the highest levels of the kingdom. The king was a traitor. The head steward was complicit. And the prince had not died, but had fled. The ghost was not an evil spirit, but a heartbroken one, trying to protect a secret. The mournful voice was the queen's, weeping for the brother she had sent away to save him. As she finished reading, a new sound cut through the silence. It was not the weeping of a ghost, but the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man, coming down the corridor. Her heart pounded in her ears. It was not a ghost. It was someone real. The footsteps stopped right outside the study. The doorknob jiggled, slowly, then more forcefully. Someone was trying to get in. Elara's mind screamed at her to move. She blew out her lantern, plunging the room into darkness, and scrambled to hide, ducking behind a heavy, velvet curtain just as the door was slowly pushed open. The man who entered was not the head steward she had expected, but a large, powerfully built guard, his chain mail glinting dimly in the moonlight that cut through the drawn curtains. His face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes darting around the room with a practiced, predatory quickness. He was not here by chance. He was here on a mission. He held a small, glowing orb in his hand, a light source Elara had never seen before, and as he held it out, its soft, ethereal glow pushed back the shadows and illuminated the room, bathing it in a pale, almost ghostly light. His gaze swept over the room, pausing on the empty space where the wooden box had been. A low growl of frustration rumbled in his chest, a sound so guttural and animalistic that Elara's entire body went rigid. He moved with a purpose, his heavy boots making no sound on the stone floor, a testament to his training. He didn't seem to notice the disturbed curtain. He went directly to the writing desk and began to search, pulling out drawers, his movements precise and methodical. He was searching for something, and Elara knew with a cold, hard certainty that it was the letter she now held. The man was a trained killer, and she was a simple servant girl. The odds were not in her favor. As he searched, he muttered to himself, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The head steward's orders. It must be here. He knows the king will not tolerate any loose ends. Elara's mind raced. The head steward. He was working for the king, and he was searching for the letter. The man's words confirmed everything the queen's letter had said. The conspiracy was real. She had not imagined it. She was holding a piece of evidence that could change the fate of the kingdom, and the people who wanted it hidden were right there, inches away. The man's hands moved over the desk, his fingers searching, his eyes narrowed. He was close. Too close. Elara's heart was a frantic, trapped bird, and she could feel the cold sweat beating on her forehead. The air in her lungs felt thin, and she fought the urge to cough, to make any sound that would betray her presence. He paused his search, his head cocked to the side as if listening. Elara held her breath, her eyes wide with terror, her mind screaming at her to remain still. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the room again, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, his eyes seemed to land right on the curtain where she was hiding. His hand went to the hilt of his sword, and he took a single, slow step towards her. Elara's world narrowed to this one moment. The light from his orb glinted off the hilt of his weapon, a cold, hard promise of death. She was about to be discovered. She was about to die. She had to do something. She had to run. But where? The door was blocked by the giant guard. Just as she was about to make a desperate dash, she heard a faint, high-pitched scratching sound coming from the back of the room. The guard's attention was immediately diverted. He turned his head, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "What's that?" he muttered to himself, his hand leaving the sword hilt. He moved away from the curtain, his movements silent once more. Elara watched as he went to the back of the room, to a large, dusty tapestry depicting a battle scene. He lifted the corner of the tapestry, revealing a small, hidden passage in the stone wall, a gap just big enough for a person to slip through. The scratching sound was louder now, a frantic noise. And then, a small, black cat darted out from the passage, its eyes wide with terror. It was a familiar sight in the kitchens, a scruffy stray that sometimes came to steal scraps. The cat, seeing the guard, hissed, its fur standing on end, and then, without hesitation, it darted out the front door, slipping past the guard's legs and disappearing into the corridor. The guard let out a frustrated grunt and went to follow it. But just as he reached the door, he heard a new sound, the heavy, rhythmic tramp of the night guard's patrol, coming from the end of the hall. He hesitated, then slammed the door shut, locking it from the outside. The sound of his footsteps grew fainter as he retreated, leaving Elara in the darkness once more, alone with the Queen's secret and the terrible truth. Elara remained frozen, pressed against the cold stone, listening with an almost painful intensity as the sound of the guard's footsteps receded, his heavy boots fading into the distant, rhythmic tramp of the night patrol. The silence that followed was not a relief. It was a deeper, more profound kind of terror, a vacuum filled with the echoes of his low growl and the chilling weight of her new reality. The glowing orb he had carried had cast a pale, unearthly light, and now that it was gone, the darkness felt even more absolute, a living, breathing entity that clung to her. The Queen's letter, a fragile piece of parchment, felt like a burning coal in her hand, a burden heavier than any pot she had ever scrubbed. It held not just a secret, but a death sentence. Her own. She was no longer just a servant girl, she was a witness, a conspirator by accident, a carrier of a truth that could topple the king. She was a ghost in the palace, but now she had proof that the real ghosts were the living ones, the ones who had buried the truth and were willing to kill to keep it that way. The faint, sorrowful weeping was still there, a soft hum of sound in the air, and for the first time, Elara didn't feel fear. She felt a deep, aching empathy. The Queen wasn't a monster, she was a victim, a heartbroken soul who had been betrayed by the very man she had loved. She was weeping for her lost brother and her lost kingdom. And now, she was weeping for Elara, who had stumbled upon her final, desperate secret. Elara's mind, always quick and observant, replayed the guard's movements. He hadn't been searching for the box itself, but for its contents. He knew exactly what he was looking for. He hadn't noticed the disturbed curtain, his attention too focused on the desk, his single-minded purpose almost blinding him. But then the cat. That scruffy, nameless kitchen cat, which had appeared from a hidden passage in the wall. The guard had been so close, his eyes about to find her, and then the cat had saved her life. It wasn't a coincidence. It was as if the universe, or perhaps the Queen herself, had sent a small, furry messenger to save her. A new thought, a single, clear spark in the darkness, flared in her mind. The letter had said, "I have hidden the evidence in a place only you would know." You was Prince Aurelian. What would a prince and his queen's sister share as a secret? A hidden passage, a way to escape, a way to communicate without being seen. The cat's passage. It was the place only you would know. It was the other way out. It was where the rest of the evidence was. With a new sense of purpose that pushed aside her fear, Elara crept out from behind the curtain. Her bare feet were silent on the cold stone floor, a stark contrast to the guard's heavy, purposeful boots. She felt her way to the tapestry, her hands brushing against the woven threads of knights and dragons. She found the loose corner and lifted it, revealing the small, dark opening in the wall. The space was tiny, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. It smelled of damp earth and stale air, and the darkness inside was absolute, a deeper, more suffocating darkness than the room itself. A voice in her mind, a voice that sounded a lot like her grandmother back in the village, told her to run, to go back to the kitchens, to forget everything she had seen. But she couldn't. She was already in too deep. The Queen's ghost had led her here. The guard had almost caught her. There was no going back. With a deep, shaky breath, she got down on her hands and knees and crawled into the small opening. The stone was rough against her skin, and the ceiling was so low that her back scraped against the jagged edges. She crawled on, blindly, for what felt like an eternity. The passage twisted and turned, and she had to navigate by feel alone. The cold was a constant companion, seeping into her bones. She wasn't just escaping from the guard. She was entering a different world, a world of secrets and shadows that lay beneath the perfect, polished facade of the palace. After what seemed like a lifetime, the passage widened slightly, and she was able to stand, though she had to hunch over. She felt a change in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. She saw a tiny sliver of light up ahead, a pinprick of white that seemed to pulse with life. With renewed hope, she moved towards it, her heart pounding with anticipation. She reached the end of the passage, and with a final push, she crawled out into a small, hidden room. It was not a grand chamber, but a tiny, dusty room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with no windows. The walls were lined with books, old and yellowed, their spines cracked and faded. In the center of the room was a small, crudely made table, with a single, unlit candle on it. But what caught Alara's eye was the object on the table, bathed in the soft, ethereal light from a small, glowing orb, a twin of the one the guard had carried. It was a small leather satchel, old and worn, the kind a traveler might carry. As Alara's eyes adjusted to the light, she saw what was inside the satchel. It was not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable. There were 3 more letters, each tied with a faded ribbon. She also saw a small, beautiful dagger with an ornate, jeweled hilt. The letters were addressed to Prince Aurelian, and they were all in the Queen's handwriting. But they were not letters of a grieving sister. They were coded messages. Alara's mind, so used to the simple truths of kitchen life, was now being forced to think in a world of conspiracy and treason. These weren't just letters, they were instructions. A guide to the king's plans. A plan to save the kingdom. She opened the first letter. The words were a jumble of nonsensical rhymes and poems, but at the bottom, there was a small, hand-drawn symbol, a sun with 8 rays. The same symbol that was on the locket. It was a key. She had to use the locket to decipher the code. She was holding not just a secret, but a master key to the king's downfall. She sat on the dusty floor, her back against the cold stone wall, the satchel in her lap, and began to read. The dagger felt cold in her hand, but it was not a weapon of fear. It was a weapon of purpose. She had a choice to make now. She could run. She could leave the palace, take the satchel with her, and disappear forever. She could forget everything she had seen and go back to her simple life. But she couldn't. The memory of the Queen's mournful weeping, the look of silent desperation in her painted eyes on the locket, the terror in the voice of the guard, all of it held her. She had a responsibility now. She had to find Prince Aurelian. She had to get him the evidence. She didn't know how to find him. She didn't even know if he was alive. But the Queen had believed he was. And if the Queen could believe in her brother, Alara could believe in her Queen. The task was overwhelming, and she had no idea where to start. The palace was a fortress, and she was trapped inside, a tiny pawn in a game far bigger than she could ever have imagined. She was alone, in the dark, with nothing but a satchel of secrets and a truth that could get her killed. The silence was broken by the sound of a distant bell, the morning bell, signaling the start of a new day. A new day, a new risk, and a new life. Alara took a deep breath, and as she stood up, the light from the glowing orb on the table flickered and went out, plunging the room into absolute, suffocating darkness once more. The morning bell's distant chime, a sound that for years had meant the beginning of another monotonous day of scrubbing floors and polishing silverware, now felt like a death knell. Alara stood in the absolute, suffocating darkness of the hidden room, the satchel of secrets clutched to her chest, her heart a frantic, trapped bird against her ribs. The faint, high-pitched scratching of the kitchen cat she had heard earlier had stopped, leaving her in a silence so profound it roared in her ears. She was completely, utterly alone, surrounded by the secrets of a dead queen and a truth so dangerous it had almost gotten her killed. The light from the magical orb on the table had vanished, and now she couldn't even see her own hand in front of her face. The darkness felt like a physical weight, a living, breathing entity that pressed in on her, and the smell of damp earth and old, decaying paper was overwhelming. She had to get out. The thought was a desperate, primal scream in her mind. She couldn't stay here. The guard, that hulking, menacing figure, would be back. He would have checked the perimeter, found no one, and would return to the one place he hadn't fully searched, this room. He would not be fooled by a mere cat twice. Her hands, trembling with a fear that was colder and sharper than the chill of the passage, fumbled in the darkness, searching for the opening she had come through. She found it, a small, jagged gap in the stone, and with a grunt of effort she began to crawl back into the narrow, winding passage. The satchel was a clumsy, heavy thing, and she had to push it ahead of her, the leather scraping against the rough stone walls. She was a simple girl, a kitchen maid, and her world had been turned upside down in a single night. She had stumbled into a web of conspiracy, a dark, hidden world that existed just beneath the polished surface of the palace, and she had no idea how to get out. The Queen's locket, the coded letters, the beautiful, jeweled dagger, they were not just objects. They were keys, clues, and weapons in a game she didn't know how to play. As she crawled, she replayed the guard's movements, the way his eyes had swept the room, his low, guttural growl of frustration. He was methodical. He wouldn't give up. The thought of him coming back, his glowing orb lighting up the small, dark passage, was a fresh wave of terror that pushed her forward, her knees and elbows scraping against the stone. She felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her shin as she hit a rock, and she bit back a cry of pain. She couldn't afford to make a sound. She was a shadow, a whisper, a ghost. She had to be. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of crawling in the dark, she saw a faint sliver of light up ahead. It was the light from the Queen's study, a pale, dusty shaft of moonlight from the window. She pushed herself forward with a final, desperate burst of energy and crawled out into the room. The air was colder here, but it smelled of dust and old paper, a welcome scent after the musty air of the passage. She stood, her body aching and trembling, and looked around. The room was empty. The guard was gone. The door was still closed, but now she knew it wasn't locked. He had just pulled the heavy iron bar back into place. She crept to the door and listened. The distant tramp of the guard's patrol was gone, swallowed by the silence of the night. A faint, sorrowful weeping, a sound she was now so used to she barely noticed it, still hummed in the air. She slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. The corridor was as she had left it, long and dark, with the ancient torches casting long, twisted shadows. She ran, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, not stopping until she was out of the north wing and back in the familiar, bustling heart of the palace. The morning was in full swing now. Maids and guards moved through the corridors, their voices a low, comforting murmur. The smell of cooking food filled the air. She slipped into a hidden alcove and waited, her heart still a frantic drum against her ribs. She was a part of the palace again, a small, insignificant cog in the great, intricate machine of royal life. But she was no longer the same girl. She had seen the machine's inner workings, and they were rotten. Later that morning, as she carried a heavy bucket of water to the kitchens, she saw him. The head steward. He was talking to a guard, a man with the broad shoulders and muscular frame of a trained soldier. The same guard. The guard who had almost caught her. He was holding a small, glowing orb, the same kind of magical light source she had seen in the study. The head steward was a man with a stern, imposing face, and his voice was a low, commanding rumble. He was not a man to be trifled with. As he spoke, he gestured towards the north wing, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I don't know where it went. I have checked every inch of the wing. It must have found its way out. The king will not be pleased." The guard's face was a mask of grim determination. "I will find it, my lord. No secret is safe in this palace. I will not fail again." Elara's breath hitched. They were not talking about a ghost. They were talking about the satchel, about the letters, about the truth she was holding. Her heart, which had just started to slow down, now began to beat a frantic rhythm again. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. They knew the secret was loose, and they would do anything to get it back. She had to find a way to escape, to get out of the palace and find Prince Aurelian. She had to get the evidence to him. But how? The palace was a fortress, its gates guarded by an army of soldiers. A servant girl had no chance. As she walked, her mind raced, trying to find a solution. The kitchen was a safe place, a small, familiar world of heat and noise and food. But it was a cage. She had to find a way out. The thought came to her suddenly, a small, brilliant spark of an idea in the suffocating darkness of her fear. The annual royal feast. It was only 2 days away. Every year, for 3 days, the palace gates were opened to the people. A great feast was held in the courtyard, and the people, commoners and nobles alike, came to celebrate. It was a time of chaos and celebration, a time when the guards were distracted, their attention focused on the food and wine and the entertainment. It was her only chance. She had to wait for 2 days. She had to hide, to lie, to pretend she was just another kitchen maid. She had to keep the secret safe. She had to survive. She spent the next 2 days in a state of constant, low-grade terror. Every glance from a guard, every unexpected sound, sent a jolt of fear through her. She hid the satchel in her straw mattress, burying it deep under the straw where no one would think to look. The locket she kept in a small pouch tied to a string and tucked inside her tunic, close to her heart, a constant, comforting reminder of the Queen's sacrifice. She worked her usual shifts, scrubbing pots and floors, her movements precise and automatic, her mind a million miles away, lost in a world of princes and traitors and secrets. She was living two lives now, the life of a simple kitchen maid, and the life of a secret agent for a dead queen. The two lives were a constant, jarring contrast, and she felt like she was going to break. But she couldn't. She had a purpose now. She had a mission. And she would not fail. Finally, the day of the feast arrived. The palace was a whirlwind of activity, a vibrant, chaotic world of color and sound. The king was to address the people from the high balcony overlooking the courtyard, and the entire palace was a sea of people. Servants, nobles, commoners, they all mingled in a great, happy throng. It was the perfect cover. Elara, dressed in a borrowed cloak, her head covered with a hood, slipped out of the kitchens and into the crowd. She was a small, insignificant thing, a single drop of water in a vast ocean. She was finally free. She had to be careful, though. The guards were everywhere, and they would be looking for anyone who seemed out of place. She moved through the crowd, a shadow among the people, her eyes darting nervously, her hand clutched around the locket beneath her tunic. She was out. But now, she was alone. The palace was a cage, but it was a familiar cage. The world outside was a vast, unknown place. Where would she go? How would she find Prince Aurelian? She had no money, no connections, nothing but a locket and a satchel of secrets. As she moved through the crowd, she felt a sudden, sharp tug on her arm. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she froze, her mind screaming. She turned, her eyes wide with terror. It was not a guard. It was a small, withered hand belonging to an old, bent woman, her face a mass of wrinkles, her eyes kind and knowing. She was a fortune-teller, a common sight at the royal feasts. She was holding Elara's hand, her fingers surprisingly strong. She looked at Elara, her eyes clear and ancient. "You carry a great burden, child," she whispered, her voice a dry, rustling sound. "A great burden, but also a great key. The sun will guide you." And then, she was gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving Elara alone once more, her mind reeling with the old woman's mysterious words. The sun? The symbol on the locket was a sun with 8 rays. It was a sign. The queen was still guiding her. Elara felt a new sense of purpose, a strange, beautiful sense of destiny. She was not alone. The queen was still with her. As the king's voice boomed from the balcony, a loud, triumphant sound that echoed through the courtyard, Elara slipped through the gates and out into the city, into a world of new danger, new challenges, and a new life. She looked up at the sky, and there, a small, shy sliver of the sun broke through the clouds, bathing her face in a soft, golden light. A sign. She had to follow the sun. It would lead her to Prince Aurelian. Elara slipped through the massive iron gates of the palace, becoming a single, insignificant point in the churning sea of people. The familiar, suffocating grandeur of the castle was behind her, replaced by the vibrant chaos of the city. The air, which had always been stale and heavy with the scent of old tapestries and polished wood, was now alive with 1,000 different smells: roasted meats from street vendors, the sharp tang of spices, the earthy perfume of fresh-cut flowers, and the coppery scent of the city's great river. The sound was a deafening roar, a cacophony of laughter, shouting, and the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Her small, simple life was over. She had stepped out of one cage and into a larger, more dangerous one. The locket, her secret weapon, felt like a burning coal against her skin. The satchel, hidden in her borrowed cloak, felt as heavy as a stone. She was a ghost in the palace, but now she was a fugitive in the city. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. "The sun will guide you." The locket's symbol, a sun with 8 rays, was not just a symbol. It was a compass. But where did it point? The city was a maze of narrow, winding streets and crowded marketplaces. There were no grand signs or directions, only the constant, chaotic flow of people. Elara, a girl who had spent her entire life as the sun began to set, painting the sky in a blaze of orange and purple, Elara's fear began to turn to a hard, cold determination. The king and the head steward were looking for her, and they would stop at nothing to get the satchel back. She had to be clever. She had to think like them. The king was a traitor, and traitors had secrets. They had hidden places, hidden allies. Where would a prince in hiding go? Not to a grand palace, not to a nobleman's estate. He would go to the places where he wouldn't be found. The city was full of such places. She had to find the prince's secret. She had to find a place that only he would know. A place that connected to the sun. As she walked, her eyes scanned the city for the symbol on the locket, the sun with 8 rays. She saw it everywhere. On banners, on the crests of noble houses, on the faded signs of long-closed shops. It was a common symbol, a symbol of the royal family. It was no help at all. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, a feeling so deep and hopeless that she had to stop, her hand pressing against the cold stone wall. She was a fool. A simple kitchen made with a foolish fantasy. She should have stayed in the palace. She would have been safe there. She would have been alive. But then, she remembered the weeping, the ghostly, mournful sound of the queen. The queen had not wept for herself. She had wept for her kingdom, for the brother she had sent away. She had trusted Elara with her last secret. Elara couldn't fail her. She would not fail her. She pushed herself away from the wall and began to walk again, her steps more purposeful this time. She had to think. The sun symbol on the locket was a key. It was not just a simple symbol, it was a guide. It had to be. As she walked, her mind, so used to the practicalities of kitchen life, began to work in a new way. She had to think like a prince. A prince in hiding. He would not hide in a place that bore the royal crest. He would hide in a place that was overlooked, a place that was hidden in plain sight. A place that connected to the sun. But not the sun on the banners. A different kind of sun. A sun in the sky. She looked up at the setting sun, a fiery orb of red and gold, and her mind began to connect the pieces. The queen's letters were written in a strange, poetic code. Maybe the key was not just the symbol, but something else. A location. A specific time. She began to walk again, this time with a new sense of direction. She walked towards the city's great river, the River of Whispers. It was a place of secrets, a place where people came to hide things and to forget things. As she walked, she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. A small, hidden alleyway, barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. It was dark and smelled of refuse, and it seemed to lead to nowhere. But at the entrance of the alley, carved into the stone, was a small, faded symbol. It was a sun with 7 rays, not 8. Elara's heart sank. She had been so sure. But then she saw it. The 8th ray, almost invisible, was a small, pointed carving on a stone. It was a clever disguise, a way to hide a secret in plain sight. She had found it. She had found a clue. With a new sense of purpose, she slipped into the alley, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The alley was dark and cold, but she could see a faint light at the end of it, a flickering, golden light. She moved towards it, her bare feet silent on the cold, damp stone. She reached the end of the alley and found herself in a small, hidden courtyard. It was not a grand, magnificent place. It was a small, dusty courtyard, with a single, unlit fountain in the center. But what caught Elara's eye was the small, unassuming door in the back of the courtyard. It was a simple, wooden door, with no lock, no latch, nothing to indicate its importance. But on the door was a single, simple carving, the sun with 8 rays. She had found it. She had found the prince's secret. She reached for the door handle, her hand trembling. But before she could open it, she heard a sound. It was the sound of a woman crying, a soft, heartbroken sound that seemed to come from inside the building. It was not the queen's mournful, ethereal weeping. This was a human sound, a sound of profound grief. Elara froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The sound was so real, so full of pain, that it filled her with a new kind of terror. Was the prince a prisoner here? Was he in trouble? She had to know. She had to help him. With a new sense of courage that came from a place she didn't know she had, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room she entered was a small, dimly lit tavern. It was a place of noise and chaos, and the smell of cheap ale and stale tobacco. Men and women sat at small, dusty tables, their faces hidden in the shadows. A single, small candle flickered on a table in the corner, and a woman, her face buried in her hands, was sobbing softly. It was the woman she had heard. Alara's mind, so used to the polished, formal world of the palace, was a dizzying blur of new sights and sounds. She was a ghost here. No one noticed her. No one paid her any mind. She looked around, her eyes scanning the room for the prince. He had to be here. This was his secret place. The sun had guided her here. Then she saw him. He was not the dashing, handsome prince she had imagined. He was a man with a beard, his clothes simple and worn, his face etched with a profound, deep sorrow. He was sitting at a table in the corner, his head in his hands, a half-empty tankard of ale in front of him. He was not looking for her. He was not looking for anyone. He was a broken man, a ghost in a world that had forgotten him. Alara's heart went out to him. She had to go to him. She had to give him the satchel. She had to tell him the truth. But as she moved towards him, a new figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, tall and muscular, with the face of a guard she had seen at the palace. The same guard. He was looking at the prince, his eyes narrowed, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He was here. The king knew the prince was here. He had not sent the guard after Alara. He had sent him after the prince. The satchel was not the king's primary concern. The prince was. Alara's mind reeled. She had walked straight into a trap. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, a cold, sharp spike of panic that stole the air from her lungs. She was no longer a ghost in the shadows. She was a witness to a murder in the making. The guard was here, in this small, grimy tavern, and he was not looking for her. He was looking for the prince. The satchel of secrets, the queen's final message, had been a diversion, a brilliant, terrifyingly effective trick to make the king's men believe her to be the sole target, to draw their attention away from the man who was the true threat, Prince Aurelian himself. The king had known all along where the prince was, or at least he had a man who could find him, a man so determined he had searched an entire palace for a single, small satchel, only to find the real prize here, in a forgotten corner of the city. The guard, that hulking, menacing man with the cold eyes and the silent footsteps, was now moving, a predator stalking his prey. He was not making a sound, just a quiet, deliberate presence, slipping through the crowded tavern, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He was getting closer to the prince's table, a table hidden in the deepest, darkest corner of the room, a table so insignificant that no one had paid it any mind. But the guard knew where he was going. He was moving with the certainty of a man who had a map in his head, a map of the city's secrets. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird trying to escape its cage. She was still a ghost, a shadow in the room, but her invisibility felt less like a blessing and more like a curse. She had to do something. She had to warn him. But how? She couldn't shout. That would only alert the guard and the entire tavern, and she would be a dead girl before she could get a word out. She couldn't run. That would leave the prince to his fate, and she had promised the queen, a promise she had made with a dead woman in a silent palace. She had to find another way. A quiet way. A way to get his attention without getting herself killed. Her eyes darted around the room, frantically searching for a solution. The room was a sea of people, a chaotic world of noise and laughter, and the clinking of glasses. There was a lone candle flickering on the table, a single point of light in the darkness. There were wooden tankards, half empty, and plates with the remains of meals on them. There were shadows everywhere, long and dark, a perfect place to hide. But there was no time to hide. The guard was almost there. He was only a few feet away from the prince's table. She had to act now. Her mind, so used to the simple, practical problems of kitchen life, was now working at a speed she never thought possible. A distraction? That was it. She needed a distraction, something so loud and so unexpected that it would give the prince enough time to look up, to see the danger. Then she saw her. The woman. The one who had been crying, her face buried in her hands. She was still sitting in the corner, a figure of profound grief, her body shaking with silent sobs. She was right in the middle of the guard's path, a barrier between him and the prince. Elara knew what she had to do. With a new sense of purpose that pushed aside her fear, she began to move, a small, silent figure, slipping through the shadows, her eyes fixed on the crying woman. She was a servant. She knew how to be invisible. She knew how to move through a crowded room without being seen. She reached the woman's table, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She knelt down, a silent shadow in the darkness, and reached out, her hand gently touching the woman's shoulder. The woman flinched, her body tensing, and her head snapped up. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, were wide with fear, not grief. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, a creature trapped and terrified. She wasn't just crying from sadness. She was crying from terror. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and Elara's mind reeled with a new, terrifying realization. The woman wasn't just a random stranger. She was part of the secret. The guard, who had stopped his advance, was not looking at the prince. He was looking at her, a look of grim determination on his face. He had come for her, not for the prince. He had found her, and he was not going to let her go. The prince, who had been sitting with his head in his hands, his body a slumped, broken mess, now looked up, his eyes, dark and haunted, fixed on the scene. He saw the woman's terror. He saw the guard's face. He saw Elara, a small, insignificant kitchen maid, kneeling at the woman's side. The pieces he had been trying to put together for months, now fell into place. His mind, so full of a profound, deep sorrow, was now working at the speed of light. He knew the guard. He knew the woman. He knew the secret. But he didn't know Elara. And yet she was here, a small, brave figure, a beacon of hope in a world of treachery. The guard moved, his hand now on the sword, his face a mask of cold, hard purpose. "It's over, Lyra," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "The king knows everything. You can't hide anymore." The woman, Lyra, shook her head, her face a mask of desperate defiance. "No," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound. "I will not betray him. I will not betray the queen." The guard's eyes, cold and merciless, swept over her, a look of contempt on his face. "The queen is dead, you fool. And the prince is a ghost. There is no one to save you." But there was someone. A small, insignificant kitchen maid who had stumbled upon a secret she was never meant to find. Elara looked at the prince, her eyes pleading. He saw her, and a flicker of something, a spark of hope, a new purpose, flashed in his dark, haunted eyes. He saw the locket hanging from her neck, the sun with 8 rays, the symbol of his family, the symbol of the truth. He understood. The queen had not just sent her brother away. She had sent her secrets away, a final, desperate act of defiance. And now, those secrets, in the form of a small, brave kitchen maid, were here, in a tavern, in the heart of a city that had forgotten them. The guard, his attention now fully on the woman, had not even noticed her. He had no idea that the real danger was not the woman. It was the girl. The one he had almost caught in the palace. The one who had the satchel. The one who had the truth. Elara knew she had to move. The guard was about to make his move, and when he did, he would see her. She had to get to the prince. She had to give him the satchel. She had to tell him the truth. But how? The guard was between them. And the tavern, once a safe harbor of anonymity, now felt like a death trap, a cage with no way out. The woman, Lyra, a new player in this deadly game, was about to make her move. She looked at the guard, a strange, beautiful smile on her face. A smile of resignation. A smile of defiance. A smile of a woman who was about to die. She raised her hand, her fingers curled into a fist, and then, with a sound like a thunderclap, she slammed her fist down on the table, shattering the half-empty tankard of ale, the glass shattering on the floor in a spray of liquid and sharp shards, the sound echoing through the tavern, a signal, a cry of war. The guard's eyes widened in surprise, and in that moment, that small, beautiful moment of chaos, Elara moved. She was not a kitchen maid anymore. She was a shadow, a whisper, a force of nature, moving towards a prince she had never met, to give him a satchel of secrets that could save a kingdom. The shattering of the tankard was a signal, a cry of war that sliced through the tavern's dull murmur. The chaos was instantaneous. A startled roar erupted from the patrons, and chairs scraped against the floor as people jumped to their feet. The single flickering candle on Lyra's table was snuffed out in the scuffle, plunging that corner of the room into absolute darkness. But the light from other tables, scattered like lonely stars, cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls. Elara, a small, dark blur, moved through them. She was a fish swimming against a violent current, her body pushing through the confused, shouting patrons who were either ducking for cover or shoving their way toward the exit. The air filled with the sharp, sweet smell of spilled ale and the metallic tang of fear. A man bumped hard into her, and she stumbled, but her momentum kept her moving. She had to get to him. The guard, his eyes wide with a fleeting surprise, was frozen for just a split second, a mistake that would cost him everything. He had been so focused on Lyra, so sure of his victory, that he had not seen the small, insignificant shadow moving behind the tables. In that brief, chaotic moment, Elara closed the distance. The prince, who had been staring at Lyra, now looked up. His eyes, once so full of a profound, deep sorrow, were now alight with a new kind of awareness, a grim, battle-hardened alertness. He had seen the way Elara had moved, a silent, determined force, and he knew in that moment that she was not just a maid. He saw the locket around her neck, its sun symbol a beacon of defiance in the dim light, and he understood. The queen had not just sent him a message. She had sent him a soldier. A strange, beautiful, and utterly unexpected soldier. As Elara reached his table, the world seemed to slow down. She grabbed his arm, her small, trembling hand surprisingly strong. He looked at her, his eyes, dark and haunted, meeting hers. "I have something for you," she whispered, her voice a reedy, breathless sound. "From the queen." She pushed the satchel into his hands, the leather surprisingly soft against his calloused fingers. The weight of it was a promise, a burden, and a new life all at once. The satchel was not just a bag of papers. It was the future of a kingdom. The guard, his moment of shock now over, roared with rage. He shoved a man aside, his broad shoulders clearing a path, and his hand was on his sword. "You!" he bellowed, his voice a great, terrible sound that cut through the tavern's noise. "Give me that!" He was moving with a new, terrifying speed, a predator who had just been denied his prey. He was not just a guard anymore. He was the king's will, a force of vengeance, and he would not be stopped. The prince, his mind working with a clarity he had not felt in years, grabbed Elara by the arm and pulled her towards him, shoving her behind his table. He stood, his body a shield, his eyes fixed on the guard. "Lyra," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Go. Now." The woman, Lyra, a new fire in her eyes, nodded, and with a swift, elegant movement, she slipped out of her seat and vanished into the crowd. She was not a prisoner. She was an ally, and her act of defiance had been a well-timed, well-executed signal. The guard, who had been so sure of his victory, was now faced with two new enemies, a prince who was no longer a ghost, and a kitchen maid who was no longer a shadow. The guard reached their table, his sword half-drawn, a look of murderous rage on his face. The prince, who had no sword, no weapon, no anything but the satchel of secrets, held his ground. He was a prince, after all, and even in this grimy tavern, he had an air of command that was as old and as deep as the kingdom itself. He looked at the guard, a strange, beautiful smile on his face. "You've made a mistake, my friend," he said, his voice as calm and as cool as a mountain stream. "You came for me, but you got her. And now you have a problem." The guard's eyes, cold and merciless, swept over him, then landed on Elara, who was cowering behind the table, her body trembling. He laughed, a low, guttural sound. "A problem?" he sneered. A simple girl? A prince with no sword and no army? I have you both. The king will be pleased. He lunged, his sword now. He had a meat cleaver in his hand, and he was not afraid to use it. Leave them be, he said, his voice a low, gravelly growl. The guard, who had been so sure of his victory, now hesitated, his eyes darting to the butcher, then to the other patrons, who were now standing, their faces grim, their hands on their own crude weapons, knives, clubs, even broken tankards. The tavern was not just a tavern anymore. It was a fortress, a bastion of defiance, and the prince was not alone. In that moment of hesitation, the prince acted. He grabbed a half-empty tankard of ale from the table and threw it at the guard's face. The ale, a foul, bitter liquid, splattered across the guard's face, and he roared with rage, his hands going to his eyes. The prince, with Alara still clinging to his arm, darted out of the tavern, leaving the angry, confused mob to deal with the blind, spluttering guard. They ran, their feet pounding on the cold, damp cobblestones, a new, exhilarating sense of purpose filling their hearts. They were no longer a prince and a maid. They were fugitives on the run, on a mission to save a kingdom. The city was a dark, twisting maze of alleyways and streets. They ran for what felt like hours, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, the sounds of the tavern long gone. They were alone again, just the two of them, a prince and a girl, bound by a satchel and a secret. They finally stopped in a small, deserted courtyard, a place of peace and quiet. The moon was a pale, silver sliver in the sky, and the stars were a million tiny, watchful eyes. They stood there, breathing heavily, their bodies trembling from the adrenaline. The prince, his face a mask of grim determination, looked at Alara. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low, raw sound. "And why do you have this?" He held up the satchel, the symbol of the queen's trust, the symbol of a dead woman's last, desperate hope. Alara looked at him, a man she had only ever seen in her dreams, and she knew she could trust him. He was not a prince in a fairy tale. He was a real man, a man who had suffered, a man who had lost everything. And in that moment she knew she was no longer a maid. She was a conspirator, an accomplice. A co-conspirator in a great, terrible, and beautiful game. The prince, seeing the trust in her eyes, nodded. "My name is Aurelian," he said, his voice a low, quiet sound. "And now we have to talk. About my mother. And about the king. And about what's in that satchel." He gestured to a small, unlit lantern on a nearby bench. "Light that," he said. "And we will talk. We have a kingdom to save." He opened the satchel, and inside she saw the letters, the coded messages, and the beautiful, jeweled dagger. It was not a dagger of war. It was a dagger of truth. A dagger that would cut through the lies and treachery that had poisoned the kingdom. As Alara lit the lantern, its soft, golden light pushing back the darkness, she knew that her journey was just beginning. The sun, the symbol on her locket, had guided her to him. And now, the light of a small, insignificant lantern would guide them both to a new, terrifying, and dangerous truth. The soft, golden light of the lantern pushed back the deep shadows of the secluded courtyard, illuminating the grim determination on Aurelian's face and the mix of fear and resolve on Alara's. The air, which had been thick with the frantic energy of their escape, now settled into a quiet, heavy stillness. The distant sounds of the city felt muffled, as if they were in a world of their own, a small pocket of light surrounded by an ocean of darkness and danger. Aurelian's eyes, once so full of a profound, deep sorrow, were now sharp and focused, fixed on the satchel he held in his hands. He took out the first item, a stack of letters, their parchment old and brittle, tied with a simple, frayed ribbon. The writing was in a script Alara did not recognize, a strange, elegant code of symbols and loops that looked more like art than letters. "These are my mother's," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper that barely disturbed the quiet. "Her private journals, her thoughts, her fears, and her secrets. She sent me messages in this code for years, but I could only ever read the surface layer. The simple, loving words. The deeper meaning, it was beyond me. I was a fool." He looked at the letters, a profound sadness in his eyes. He had been so close, and yet so far from the truth. The queen had given him the key, but he had not been able to see it. It had been right there, in front of him all along. He then carefully pulled out the next item. It was the dagger. It wasn't a weapon of war, not in the traditional sense. Its blade was thin and delicate, made of a polished silver so bright it almost seemed to hum with a quiet light. The hilt was a work of art, a masterpiece of intricate filigree with a large, polished ruby set in its center, surrounded by 8 small, sparkling diamonds. Elara instantly recognized the symbol, the sun with 8 rays, the same as the one on her locket. "This is the dagger of the sun," Aurelian said, his voice now a little stronger, a little more confident. "A symbol of my family, passed down from generation to generation. It is said to be a key to a truth that lies hidden in plain sight. My mother once told me that the dagger was not meant for killing, but for revealing. It would show the truth to those who were willing to see." He turned the dagger over in his hands, its jeweled hilt glinting in the lantern light. It was not a weapon but a tool. A tool for cutting through the lies that had poisoned the kingdom. "The queen, my mother, she told me stories about a secret chamber in the palace," Aurelian continued, his eyes now fixed on Elara. "A chamber built by our ancestors, a place where they stored all their secrets, their plans, their dark histories. It was a place where they kept the truth safe. She told me that only a true heir, a true leader could open it, and that the key was the dagger. But she never told me where it was. She only ever spoke of it in riddles and rhymes. I thought it was just a fairy tale, a child's story." He looked at the dagger, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. The dagger of the sun. The symbol on the locket. The key. The sun had guided him to Elara, and now the dagger would guide them both to the truth. Elara, who had been listening with a rapt attention, now spoke. "The north wing," she said, her voice a small, hesitant sound. "The queen, she wept there. I heard her. And I heard her say his name. Aurelian. She said your name? She said she had a secret for you. A secret in the north wing. The secret chamber, it must be there." Aurelian's eyes widened, a look of profound shock and realization on his face. He had searched the north wing, every inch of it, for years. He had walked through its cold, silent corridors, looking for any sign, any secret, but he had found nothing. He had only found a ghost, a legend, a story. But Elara had heard the truth. Elara had heard the queen weep. And Elara had the locket. The locket. Aurelian reached out and gently touched the locket that was hanging from her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin. It was warm, alive with a quiet, humming energy. It was not just a symbol. It was a part of the queen. A part of the truth. "You have the key," he whispered, his voice full of a new, profound sense of wonder. "The locket, it is not a simple piece of jewelry. It is a lock. A part of the key. My mother, she was so clever." He looked at Elara, a strange, beautiful smile on his face. He had spent years in a cold, lonely darkness, a ghost in a world that had forgotten him. And now, in a small, grimy courtyard, a small, insignificant kitchen maid had brought him back to life. She was not a maid. She was a hero. His hero. Their conversation was now a torrent, a dam of secrets that had been held back for years, now finally broken. Aurelian told Elara about his father's illness, a strange, wasting sickness that had left him a shell of a man, his mind clouded, his body frail. He told her about the king, his uncle, a man who had always been full of ambition, a man who had always wanted the throne. He told her about his mother's fear, a fear that was not for herself, but for her kingdom, a kingdom that was slowly, surely, being poisoned by her brother-in-law's greed. The king, his uncle, had been slowly poisoning his father, bit by bit, day by day, and his mother had known it. She had been trying to find a way to stop him, a way to reveal his treachery, but she had run out of time. Elara, in turn, told him about the palace. The whispers. The servants' gossip. The cold, lifeless silence that had settled over the castle after the king took over. She told him about the head steward, a man who was as cold and as calculating as his master. She told him about the strange, unsettling atmosphere in the north wing, a place where a small, loyal group of servants, the Queen's old allies, still kept the secret of the chamber alive. They were ghosts too, hiding in plain sight, their loyalty to the Queen a quiet. The night wore on, the moon a small, silent witness to their shared secrets. They had no idea where they were going. They had no idea what they were doing. They were just two people, a prince and a maid, bound by a satchel and a secret, a small, fragile spark of hope in a world of darkness. The sun, the symbol on her locket, had guided her to him. And now the dagger, the key, the symbol of the truth, would guide them both to the secret chamber in the north wing. It was a fool's errand. A suicidal mission. But they had no choice. They had to go back to the palace. Back to the prison. Back to the heart of the darkness. Because the truth that could save a kingdom, was waiting for them there. As the moon began to set, they stood up, their bodies sore, their minds exhausted. But there was a new strength in them, a quiet, unbreakable resolve. They were no longer running from a danger. They were running towards a truth. They were a prince and a maid. And they had a kingdom to save. The journey was not over. It had just begun. With a shared, unspoken understanding, they left the small courtyard, stepping back into the city's dark, winding maze. The night was a canvas of deep blues and blacks, the streetlights mere smudges of orange against the encroaching dawn. They moved like shadows, their footsteps a soft, rhythmic patter on the cold, damp cobblestones. Elara led the way, her intimate knowledge of the city's back alleys and hidden passages an unexpected gift. She was no longer just a maid, she was a guide, her small body moving with a newfound confidence, her eyes, usually downcast, now scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Aurelian followed, his noble bearing replaced by the hunched posture of a fugitive. He was no longer the elegant prince she had only ever seen in paintings. He was a man on the run, his long cloak pulled tight around him, his face a grim mask of resolve. The satchel, containing his mother's secrets, felt heavy in his hands, a physical representation of the immense burden now resting on his shoulders. The dagger, hidden inside, was cold and solid, a promise of a truth he was now desperate to uncover. The air was frigid, biting at their skin and clouding their breaths in small, white puffs. They spoke in hushed whispers, the urgency of their situation forcing them to make a plan as they went. "The kitchens," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's our best way in. There's a small service entrance near the north wing. The guards never check it. Too much food, too many deliveries. They consider it a nuisance, not a threat." Aurelian nodded, his mind already racing, piecing together a mental map of the palace he had not seen in years. He knew the palace, but he had never seen it from this side, from the shadows, from the perspective of a servant. It was a new world, a dangerous world, and he was completely at her mercy. They moved quickly and silently, avoiding the main roads, slipping through narrow passages where the walls of the buildings seemed to press in on them, as if trying to keep their secret. They passed by the market square, now a silent, ghostly place of empty stalls and sleeping vendors. They passed by the grand cathedral, its tall, ornate towers reaching towards the heavens like a silent prayer. And all the while, Elara's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. She had been a ghost, a quiet, insignificant figure in the palace, and now she was an accomplice to a prince, a conspirator in a plot to save a kingdom. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, and completely overwhelming reality. She wanted to ask him a million questions. What was the truth about his father? What was in his mother's letters? What was the head steward's role in all of this? But she held her tongue, the urgency of their situation more important than her curiosity. She had a job to do, a path to follow, a secret to keep. She had to get him inside the palace, to the north wing, to the chamber of truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silent running, they reached the palace walls. The massive, stone structure loomed over them, a dark, silent fortress that seemed to touch the sky. The walls were covered in a dense, creeping ivy, its leaves a dark, velvety green even in the dim light. Elara found the small, unassuming service entrance, a simple wooden door hidden beneath the overgrowth. She knocked, a series of quick, quiet raps, a secret code she had learned from the other servants. The door opened, just a crack, and an old, wrinkled face peered out, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. "Ilara?" the old woman whispered, her voice a reedy, breathless sound. "Is it really you? We thought you were dead." Ilara nodded, a small, weary smile on her face. "I'm not dead, Marta," she said. "But I have brought a guest. A very important guest." The old woman's eyes darted past Ilara, falling on Aurelian, and they widened in shock. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, a silent scream that spoke of 1,000 questions and a profound, bone-deep terror. She recognized him. Of course, she did. He was the Ghost Prince, the boy who had vanished, the legend who had returned. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's really you." Marta let them in, pulling them into the cold, damp hallway, a place of stone and darkness that smelled of earth and old secrets. "The head steward has doubled the guards," she whispered, her eyes darting around them as if expecting a ghost to appear. "He knows there's a traitor among us. He's been interrogating everyone. We've been so scared." Aurelian's face hardened, a grim, determined look in his eyes. He was no longer a boy, a ghost. He was a prince, a man who had a kingdom to save. "We need to get to the north wing, Marta," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "We need to find the secret chamber." Marta's eyes, wide with fear, now filled with a new, quiet hope. "The chamber," she said, a small, knowing smile on her face. "Of course. The Queen's chamber. It's waiting for you, my prince. It has been waiting for you for a very, very long time." She led them through a maze of corridors, their footsteps a quiet echo in the silent halls. They passed by the kitchen, now a quiet, empty place of sleeping fires and polished pots. They passed by the grand ballroom, now a dark, silent cavern of forgotten laughter and silent music. And all the while, Ilara felt a profound sense of wonder, a quiet awe. She had walked through these halls 1,000 times, but she had never really seen them. She had always been a ghost, a shadow. But now, with a prince at her side, she was a part of the palace, a part of its secrets, a part of its history. They finally reached the north wing. It was a world of its own, a place of silence and dust, a museum of a long-dead past. The corridors were cold and dark, the tapestries on the walls faded, the windows covered in a thick layer of grime. It was a place where no one went, a place that the king's men had ignored. They were so focused on the present that they had forgotten the past. And that was their biggest mistake. The past was alive. It was breathing. It was waiting. Marta pointed to a large, ornate tapestry on the wall, a beautiful, faded scene of a golden sun rising over a kingdom. It was the same symbol as the one on Ilara's locket and the dagger. "The chamber," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, profound reverence. "It's behind the sun." With that, she turned and slipped away, a silent ghost disappearing into the darkness. They were alone again, a prince and a maid, at the heart of the darkness, at the beginning of the end. Aurelian looked at Ilara, his eyes, dark and haunted, meeting hers. "This is it," he whispered, his voice a low, raw sound. "The truth. The end of the lies. Are you ready?" Ilara looked at the tapestry, the beautiful, faded sun. She was a kitchen maid. She was a ghost. She was a hero. And she was a part of a story that was now more real than her own life. She nodded, her face a mask of quiet, unbreakable resolve. "I'm ready," she said. "I'm with you." Aurelian pulled out the dagger, its polished silver blade glinting in the dim light. He looked at the tapestry, at the beautiful, golden sun. He put the point of the dagger on the sun, and with a quiet, careful push, he began to move it, the dagger's blade a quiet, humming sound against the stone wall. The tapestry, a silent witness to a long-dead past, began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the heart of the palace itself. The truth was waiting for them, and they were ready to find it. The dagger's polished silver tip, humming with a quiet energy, sank into the stone behind the sun on the tapestry. It wasn't a sword, and it wasn't a key. It was a catalyst. The moment the point touched the stone, a low, resonant hum filled the silent hall, a sound that seemed to come from the heart of the palace itself, a deep, sorrowful melody of a long-dead past. The golden threads of the sun on the tapestry began to glow, their light a faint, beautiful pulse that filled the dark corridor. The tapestry, a silent witness to a long-dead past, began to shimmer, its intricate details dissolving into a swirling pattern of light and shadow. The wall behind it, a solid, unyielding surface just a moment ago, now seemed to ripple, to become as fluid as water. It was a magic Alara had only ever read about in old, forgotten books. It was a power that felt as old, and as deep as the kingdom itself. Aurelian, his eyes wide with a profound sense of awe and wonder, looked at Alara, his face a mix of fear and exhilaration. "It's real," he whispered, his voice a raw, breathless sound. "The stories, the legends, they were all real." The wall shimmered, and a low, grinding sound filled the air, the ancient sound of stone against stone, of a door that had been locked for centuries, now finally opening. A small, dark opening appeared, a crack in the wall, and a wave of cold, musty air, a smell of earth and dust and forgotten secrets, wafted out. Alara, her heart pounding in her chest like a frantic bird, looked at Aurelian. He was no longer a prince. He was a hero, a man who was ready to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. He was a son who was ready to find the secrets of his mother, the truth about his father, the fate of his kingdom. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just a prince, but a partner. An accomplice. A co-conspirator. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice a small, trembling sound. He nodded, a grim, determined look on his face. "I have to know," he said. "I have to know the truth." He held her hand, his fingers, strong and calloused, wrapping around her small, trembling ones. The warmth of his hand was a comfort, a quiet promise that they were in this together, that they were not alone. He was a prince, and she was a maid, but in this moment, in this dark, silent hall, they were just two people, bound by a satchel and a secret, a small, fragile spark of hope in a world of darkness. They stepped into the darkness, leaving the light of the lantern behind them, and the wall, with a low, grinding sound, closed behind them, sealing them in a world of forgotten secrets. The secret chamber was not a chamber. It was a library of secrets. The room was vast and dark, and filled with 1,000 years of dust. The air, thick with the scent of old paper and dust, was a world of its own, a world of silence and forgotten truths. The shelves, made of a dark, ancient wood, were filled with thousands of books, their leather bindings cracked and their pages yellowed with age. This was not a place of war. This was a place of knowledge. A place where the history of the kingdom was kept, not just the history of the kings and queens, but the history of the secrets, the lies, the treachery, and the truth. The center of the room was a large, round table, a solid, unyielding circle of dark wood, and on it, a single, glowing book. It was not a book of paper and ink. It was a book of light. Its pages, made of a thin, translucent material, glowed with a soft, warm light, a light that seemed to come from the heart of the truth itself. The book was open to a single page, a page filled with the same elegant, beautiful script that was in the Queen's letters. Aurelian, his eyes wide with a profound sense of awe, walked towards the table, his feet a quiet, soft sound on the dusty floor. He reached out and gently touched the glowing book, his fingers brushing against its cool, smooth surface. It was a feeling of profound, deep knowledge, a feeling of 1,000 years of secrets, a feeling of his mother's love, her fear, her last, desperate hope. The glowing words on the page began to shift, to swirl, to transform, and they began to speak to him, a voice in his mind, a low, quiet whisper that told him a story. It was the story of his father's illness, the story of his uncle's greed, the story of a kingdom that was slowly, surely, being poisoned by lies. The truth was not just a story. It was a living, breathing thing. It was a force of nature, a force that had been waiting for him, a force that had been waiting for the dagger, a force that had been waiting for Alara. Alara, who had been watching him with a profound sense of awe, now saw something else. She saw a small, ornate box on the table, its lid covered in the same elegant, beautiful script as the glowing book. It was a box of secrets, a box of answers. She reached out and gently touched the box, and a small, quiet jolt of energy, a feeling of 1,000 years of secrets, A feeling of his mother's love, her fear, her last, desperate hope, ran through her body. It was not just a box. It was a lock. A lock that could only be opened with the key. With the locket. The sun symbol on her locket, the same symbol as the one on the dagger, the same symbol as the one on the box, began to glow, its light a faint, beautiful pulse that filled the dark room. She took off the locket, her hands trembling, and with a quiet, careful movement she put it on the box. The locket and the box, two separate pieces of a long-dead past, now came together, and a soft, beautiful sound, a sound of a lock that had been locked for centuries, now finally opening, filled the silent room. The lid of the box, with a quiet, careful click, opened, and inside, she saw not just a book, not just a dagger, but the truth itself. The box was filled with a single, small, glass vial. The vial was filled with a clear, sparkling liquid, a liquid that seemed to shimmer with a quiet, dangerous light. It was a poison. The poison that had been slowly killing his father. The poison that the king, his uncle, had been giving him. It was a beautiful, deadly liquid, a liquid that looked like 1,000 tiny diamonds floating in a pool of moonlight. Elara, her breath caught in her throat, looked at Aurelian. He, who had been a ghost, a legend, a boy, was now a prince. A man. A man who held the truth in his hands. He looked at the vial, his face a mask of profound, bone-deep sorrow, a look of a man who had just found the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. He had found the truth. And it was more terrifying, more beautiful, and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He picked up the vial, his hands trembling, and he looked at Elara. This, he said, his voice a low, raw whisper. This is the proof. The truth. The end of the lies. And with this, we can save a kingdom. He put the vial back in the box, and he looked at the glowing book. The words on the page were no longer speaking to him. They were a silent, watchful testament, a silent, beautiful promise. He closed the book, and its light, with a soft, quiet sigh, faded, leaving the room in a profound, deep darkness. He was no longer just a prince. He was a conspirator. An accomplice. A co-conspirator. They were no longer just a prince and a maid. They were two people, a man and a woman, who were ready to fight a war of truth against lies, of light against darkness, of love against hate. They had the truth. And now they had to use it. They had a kingdom to save. The journey was not over. It had just begun. The profound darkness of the secret chamber, now that the glowing book had faded, felt like a living entity, heavy and oppressive, a perfect mirror to the weight of the truth in their hands. The small vial, a silent promise of revenge and justice, shimmered with a cold, ethereal light, a ghostly glimmer in the pitch black. Elara, her hands still trembling from the quiet click of the box, reached for Aurelian, her fingers finding his in the dark, their shared warmth a small, fragile anchor in the ocean of their new reality. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "We have it, we have the proof. But how do we use it?" The question hung in the air, a profound, terrifying echo in the silent library. They had the key, and they had opened the lock, but they had not thought of what would happen next. They were a prince and a maid, fugitives in their own home, and they held the fate of a kingdom in a single, small glass vial. Aurelian, his mind a whirlwind of thought, took a deep breath, the dusty air filling his lungs, a strange and unsettling reminder that he was alive, that this was real. He felt a profound sense of purpose, a quiet, unshakable resolve that had replaced the fear that had been his constant companion for years. "We need to get to the council," he said, his voice low and firm, the voice of a prince who had finally found his voice. "The king's council. They are his most trusted men. We need to expose him. We need to show them the truth." Elara's heart sank. The council. The king's hand-picked men. The very people who had benefited from his rule. They would never believe them. They would accuse them of treason. "They won't have a choice," he said. "The vial is not just poison. It is also an antidote. My mother, she was so clever. The letters, the code, she told me everything. The antidote can heal my father, but it is also a poison itself. The only way to save a man who is being slowly poisoned is to give him a dose of a more potent, and more beautiful, poison. The poison will react with the old one, and it will flush it out of his body. It's a dangerous game, but it's the only way. Alara's eyes widened, a look of profound shock and realization on her face. The queen, his mother, had not just found the antidote, she had found a way to expose the king. She had found a way to make the truth undeniable. The antidote would not just heal the king, it would also be a symbol of the king's treachery. It was a beautiful, deadly, and perfectly orchestrated plan. The queen, a woman who had been a ghost in her own castle, had been fighting a war for years, a war of truth against lies, of light against darkness, of love against hate. And she had won. They had the key to a truth that was undeniable. A truth that no one could ignore. A truth that would save a kingdom. Now, the only question was how to get out of the library. The library was a silent, unyielding prison. The wall that had opened for them had sealed shut with a low, grinding sound, leaving them with no idea of how to open it. Aurelian, his heart now filled with a new, profound sense of purpose, walked towards the bookshelves, his lantern, now lit again, casting long, dancing shadows on the dusty walls. He ran his hand over the spines of the ancient books, his fingers brushing against the cracked leather, the yellowed pages. It was a library of secrets, a library of answers, and the answer to their problem had to be there. They searched for hours, their bodies exhausted, their minds a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. They looked for a hidden switch, a secret lever, a hidden message in the books, but they found nothing. They were trapped. Trapped in a room of 1,000 truths, and yet the only truth that mattered was the one they couldn't find, the truth about how to get out. As dawn began to break outside, a faint light seeping through the cracks in the wall, Alara, who had been sitting on the floor, her mind numb with exhaustion, saw something she had missed before. A small, almost invisible symbol on the cover of the glowing book. It was not a symbol she recognized. It was a constellation, a celestial map of 1,000 tiny, sparkling stars. "Aurelian," she whispered, her voice a raw, weary sound. "Look at this. On the book." Aurelian, his face a mask of profound exhaustion, walked towards her, and his eyes, now wide with a new sense of wonder, fell on the constellation. "My mother, she used to tell me stories about the stars," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper. "She told me that the stars were not just lights in the sky. They were a map. A map to a truth that was hidden in plain sight." He looked at the constellation, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. It was not a map of the sky. It was a map of the room. The stars were not just stars. They were the key. He looked at the glowing book, and he saw the constellations on its cover, and he saw a mirror image on the ceiling, a mirror image of the stars in the constellation. He reached out and gently touched the constellations on the ceiling, and with a low, quiet hum, the constellations began to glow, their light a faint, beautiful pulse that filled the dark room. He traced the constellations on the ceiling, a celestial dance of light and shadow, and with each touch, a small, quiet jolt of energy, a feeling of 1,000 years of secrets, a feeling of his mother's love, her fear, her last, desperate hope, ran through his body. The constellations on the ceiling were not just a map. They were a lock. A lock that could only be opened with the key. With the dagger. The dagger, a cold, solid promise of a truth, now pulsed with a quiet, humming energy, and Aurelian, his hands trembling, lifted the dagger and pointed its tip towards the glowing constellations on the ceiling, and as he did, the wall, with a low, grinding sound, began to open, and a wave of cold, morning air, a smell of fresh earth and the promise of a new day, wafted out. The journey was not over. It had just begun. The cold, morning air, a welcome breath of fresh life after the stale, dusty air of the secret library, rushed in, a silent promise of a new day and a new beginning. They stepped out of the chamber, the wall closing behind them with a low, grinding sound, leaving them alone once more in the silent, forgotten world of the North Wing. The dim light of dawn, seeping through the grimy windows, cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, a ghostly light that made the faded tapestries and the silent corridors seem even more eerie. They were back in the palace, but it felt like a different world. They were no longer a prince and a maid. They were two people, a man and a woman, who held the fate of a kingdom in their hands, and they had a war to fight. A war of truth against lies. Aurelian, his hand still a comforting presence in hers, looked at Elara, his eyes, dark and haunted, now filled with a quiet, profound resolve. "The council chambers," he said, his voice a low, firm whisper. "They meet at dawn. We have to get there now. We have to expose him before he can do anything to hide his tracks." Elara's heart hammered in her chest, a frantic drum of fear and exhilaration. They were running out of time. The palace was a sleeping giant, but it would soon awaken, and with it, the king's guards, the head steward, and the cold, unyielding lie that had been their reality for years. They had to be quick. They had to be silent. They had to be smart. They moved with a newfound speed, a silent, graceful dance through the labyrinthine corridors of the palace. Elara, her intimate knowledge of the palace's back alleys and hidden passages an unexpected gift, led the way. She knew every shortcut, every hidden doorway, every secret passage that the nobles, the guards, and even the king himself had forgotten. They were no longer just a prince and a maid. They were two ghosts, two shadows, two silent conspirators in a silent revolution. They passed by the grand ballroom, now a dark, silent cavern of forgotten laughter and silent music. They passed by the king's private gardens, now a silent, ghostly place of sleeping flowers and whispering fountains. And all the while, Elara's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. She had been a ghost, a quiet, insignificant figure in the palace, and now she was an accomplice to a prince, a conspirator in a plot to save a kingdom. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, and completely overwhelming reality. As they approached the main wing of the palace, the air began to fill with the sounds of the waking palace. The distant clang of a bell. The quiet hum of 100 small voices. The rhythmic patter of footsteps on the stone floor. The guards were changing shifts. This was their chance. "The kitchen," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's our best way. There's a secret service elevator for the royal food. It takes you straight to the top floor, to the council chambers." Aurelian nodded, his mind already racing, his eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. The royal kitchens were a world of their own, a place of fire and steam, a symphony of 1,000 small noises, a place that was always a constant hive of activity. It was a place where they could get lost, where they could hide in plain sight. They slipped into the kitchens, a silent, fluid movement that went unnoticed by the hundreds of servants scurrying around, their faces a grim mask of exhaustion. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread, of roasting meat, of 1,000 different spices. Elara, her hands trembling, found the secret service elevator, a small, unassuming cage hidden behind a mountain of pots and pans. "It's a small one," she whispered. "Only for two." They stepped inside, and Elara, her fingers fumbling, pushed the button for the top floor. The elevator, with a low, groaning sound, began its slow ascent, a silent, vertical journey to the top of the world. They were going to the very heart of the palace, to the very heart of the truth. The elevator ride was a silent, tense eternity. The cage, a small, enclosed space, felt like a silent, unyielding prison, a place where their secrets could be found, where their lives could end. Elara, her heart pounding in her chest like a frantic drum, looked at Aurelian. He was no longer a prince. He was a hero, a man who was ready to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. He was a son who was ready to find the secrets of his mother, the truth about his father, the fate of his kingdom. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just a prince, but a partner. An accomplice. A co-conspirator. "We are in this together," he whispered, his voice a low, raw sound. "No matter what happens, we are in this together." His words, a quiet promise, a small, fragile spark of hope in a world of darkness, were a comfort to her, a quiet strength that she did not know she possessed. The elevator stopped with a quiet click, and the doors, with a low, hissing sound, opened. "They won't recognize me," Aurelian whispered. "My face is on 1,000 paintings, but they only know me as the ghost, the legend. I was a child when I was taken. I look nothing like the portraits now." He pulled his cloak tighter, his face a grim mask of resolve. He was no longer just a prince. He was a conspirator. An accomplice. A co-conspirator. Elara, her mind a whirlwind of thought, looked at the guards. They were two men, their faces a blank canvas of silent, unyielding duty, their eyes a cold, hard look that seemed to see right through you. They were a wall. An unyielding, impenetrable wall. Elara's mind, a quiet, brilliant mind that had been a silent witness to 1,000 secrets, now came up with a plan. A risky, dangerous, and perfectly orchestrated plan. "The water," she whispered. "They're water bottles. I saw them get new ones in the kitchen. We can use that." She took a small, almost invisible pouch from her pocket, a pouch that contained a special powder she had learned to make from an old, wise cook. It was a powder that would make you dizzy, sleepy, and a little bit sick. It was a secret weapon, a silent, and a perfectly safe way to knock someone out without hurting them. She was a maid, a ghost, a shadow, and now she was a chemist, a silent, brilliant woman who was ready to fight a war. She waited for the perfect moment, the moment when one of the guards turned his back to get something from a small cart behind him. Elara, with a silent, graceful movement, slipped out of the corridor, a silent ghost disappearing into the darkness. She crept towards the cart, her body a silent, graceful movement, and with a quiet, careful movement, she opened the water bottles, and she poured a pinch of the powder into each one. She closed the bottles, and with a silent, graceful movement, she slipped back into the corridor, a silent ghost returning to the shadows. Aurelian, who had been watching her with a profound sense of awe, now felt a new, profound respect for her. She was not just a maid. She was a hero. A woman who was not just a part of the story, but the hero of the story. The guards, with a quiet, careful movement, took a drink from their water bottles, and their faces, now a grim mask of silent, unyielding duty, now began to look a little bit sick. They were dizzy, sleepy, and a little bit sick. They were a silent, and perfectly safe, a little bit drunk, and they were no longer a wall. They were an opening that Elara and Aurelian could use to get to the truth. Aurelian looked at Elara, his face a mask of profound, bone-deep wonder. "It worked," he whispered, his voice a raw, breathless sound. "You did it." Elara, her face a mask of quiet, unbreakable resolve, nodded. "The journey is not over," she said. "It has just begun." With a quiet, careful movement, they slipped past the dizzy, sleepy guards, their bodies a silent, graceful movement, and they reached the large, ornate door, the door that led to the council chambers, the door that led to the truth. And with a quiet, careful push, they opened the door, and they stepped into the light, and 1,000 eyes, 1,000 faces, 1,000 questions, fell upon them. The council was waiting. And they were ready to speak the truth, and with a quiet, careful push, they opened the door, and they stepped into the light, and 1,000 eyes, 1,000 faces, 1,000 questions, fell upon them. The council was waiting. And they were ready to speak the truth. The council chambers were a world of cold, hard light, a world of silent, unyielding power. The room was a grand, ornate circle of dark wood, with a large, polished table in the center, a table that was the heart of the kingdom. The council members, a collection of old, wise, and powerful men, were seated around the table, their faces a grim mask of silent, unyielding duty. At the head of the table, on a raised, gilded chair, sat the king. He was a man of cold, hard power, his face a grim mask of silent, unyielding cruelty. His eyes, a cold, hard look that seemed to see right through you, fell on Elara and Aurelian, and a look of profound, bone-deep shock, a look of a man who had just seen a ghost, fell upon his face. "Aurelian?" he whispered, his voice a raw, trembling sound, a sound of a man who had just seen his past, his secrets, his lies come back to haunt him. The room fell into a profound, deep silence, a silence that was more terrifying than a scream. The council members, their faces a mask of profound, bone-deep shock, now looked at Aurelian, their eyes wide with 1,000 questions. It was him. The ghost. The legend. The prince who had been a ghost for years, now a man who had just returned to his home, a man who held the fate of a kingdom in his hands. He was a man who had returned from the dead, and his presence was a loud, unyielding testament to a truth that had been buried for years. The king, his face a mask of profound, bone-deep rage, now rose from his chair, his hands trembling, his eyes, a cold, hard look of a man who was about to kill, fell on Alara. "Guards!" he screamed, his voice a raw, guttural sound. "Guards! Arrest them! They are traitors! They are spies! They are lying!" The guards, their faces a mask of silent, unyielding duty, now rushed forward, their swords drawn, their eyes a cold, hard look that seemed to see right through you. They were coming for them. They were coming to kill them. But Aurelian, his voice a low, firm sound that filled the room, now spoke. "Wait," he commanded. "I am Prince Aurelian, the rightful heir to this throne, and I have come to tell you the truth. The truth about my father. The truth about the lies that have been poisoning this kingdom. The truth about the king's treachery." The words, a loud, unyielding testament to a truth that had been buried for years, filled the room, and the guards, their hands trembling, their swords now pointed at the floor, now stopped, their faces a mask of profound, bone-deep shock. The council members, their faces a mask of profound, bone-deep shock, now looked at the king, a look of 1,000 questions in their eyes. The king, his face a mask of profound, bone-deep rage, now looked at his son, his eyes, a cold, hard look of a man who was about to lose everything, fell on him. "He lies!" the king screamed, his voice a raw, guttural sound. "He is a fraud! He is a ghost! He is a liar! He is a traitor! He has been gone for years! You can't believe him!" Aurelian, his face a grim mask of unyielding resolve, now reached for the satchel. He pulled out the glowing dagger, the dagger that had been a silent, unyielding promise of a truth. "This," he said, his voice a low, firm sound that filled the room. "This is the Queen's dagger. It is a symbol of her truth. It is a symbol of her love. It is a symbol of her last, desperate hope. She gave this to me, to show you the truth." The dagger, its polished silver tip, now humming with a quiet energy, filled the room with a soft, warm light, a light that seemed to come from the heart of the truth itself. The council members, their faces a mask of profound, bone-deep shock, now looked at the dagger, and they saw a familiar symbol, a symbol that they had only seen on the Queen's seal, a symbol that they had only read about in old, forgotten books. The king, his face a mask of profound, bone-deep rage, now looked at the dagger, and a look of a man who had just seen a ghost, a look of a man who had just seen his past, his secrets, his lies, come back to haunt him, fell upon his face. "It's a fake!" he screamed, his voice a raw, guttural sound. "He lies! He lies!" Alara, her voice a low, firm sound that filled the room, now spoke. "He is not lying," she said. "The Queen was slowly being poisoned by her own brother. She found a way to save the king, but it was too late to save herself. This dagger, it is not just a dagger. It is a key. A key to a truth that has been hidden for years." She then took out the glowing vial. The vial, a small, glass container, filled with a clear, sparkling liquid, a liquid that seemed to shimmer with a quiet, dangerous light, filled the room with a cold, ethereal light, a ghostly glimmer in the pitch black. The council members, their faces a mask of profound, bone-deep shock, now looked at the vial, and they saw a familiar liquid, a liquid that they had seen in their own homes, a liquid that they had read about in old, forgotten books. It was the king's medicine. The king's medicine had been a slow-acting poison, and the clear liquid in the vial was the antidote. The king, his face a mask of profound, bone-deep rage, now looked at the vial, and a look of a man who had just been caught, a look of a man who had just been exposed, fell upon his face. "It's a lie!" he screamed, his voice a raw, guttural sound. "It's a fake! You can't believe them! They are traitors!" But it was too late. The truth was out. The council members, their faces a mask of profound, bone-deep shock, now looked at the king, a look of profound, bone-deep betrayal, a look of 1,000 questions, in their eyes. The king, his face a mask of